Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our front brakes. Now to do this, you're going to want to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. If you have a locking nut, make sure that you find the key for it as well. Okay, so now that the wheel's off, the next thing that we're going to have to do is push back our caliper pistons. For this caliper, you're going to have 2 pistons located inside this area right along here. To do this the easiest, I'm just going to go ahead and use a pry bar, and I'm going to carefully get in between this area up against the inside of the caliper and the rotor. While I do that, I'm going to carefully try to push this back. Get my pry bar in there. Alright, so now as you can tell, the caliper released its pressure from the rotor. Now we can continue on to our 2 17mm bolts that hold the caliper to the bracket. I'm just going to leave this one in a couple threads here, fully remove the second one. There's one caliper bolt. Let's do this one as well. There's the other. Both of these are the same. Inspect them, set them aside. Now the next thing we're going to need is a hook or a bungee cord or anything you might happen to have that can take this caliper. We'll slide it right through like this, and then we're going to hang it, making sure we're putting no pressure on our flex hose. The next thing we're going to do is start removing the pads from the bracket. I'm just going to go ahead and stick this up against here. We'll give it a little bonk and separate it. Once you have your pads out of there, I always just give them a quick inspection just to make sure it doesn't look like they're worn at an angle or anything. If it looks like they're worn at an angle, typically it's because either the pad's stuck in the bracket or maybe even one of the slider pins is stuck. Those look good. Now the next thing we're going to do is move along to our 2 22mm caliper bracket bolts. These 2 bolts hold the caliper bracket to the knuckle. Use your 22mm to remove the pair. Once again, we're going to leave the first bolt in just a couple threads, fully remove the second. Remove your bolts and your caliper bracket, inspect both, set them aside. After all that, we're going to continue on to removing the rotor from the hub. Now to do this, I always just take one of my lug nuts. I'm going to go ahead and take it and put it on here just a few good threads. Now after that, I'm going to give this a couple loving bonks just to try to break it free from the hub. You want to be very careful not to damage any of the studs right here. And of course, the reason why I put one of my lug nuts on is because when I give this a couple taps, if it falls off, I don't want it potentially completely come off and potentially hurt me. Remove your rotor. With the rotor off of there, let's continue on to cleaning up the mating surface of the hub where the rotor is supposed to press up against. Looking at this, you can tell that it's extremely discolored, and if I just take this pry bar, I can scrape off a whole bunch of debris that's on this. You need to make sure it's free and clear of all this debris, otherwise you're going to find that you have a brake pulsation, and if there's enough in there, you might also find that your lug nuts loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Now at this point, as you can tell, I've got the majority of the surface area cleaned up. The problem is if you were to look between the stud area here and the circular area of the hub, you're still going to find some debris inside this area. To clean this out, you can use a wire brush or even just one of these tools right here. Essentially, it's just going to get around it and clean it up as good as possible. Alright, so now at this point I sanded down the entire area of the mating surface on the hub. But we need to continue on past that. If you look just behind it, you might also find some surface rust along here. You want to make sure you clean that out as well, just so nothing falls down and potentially gets inside of your brand new brakes. Once that's free and clear of any debris, continue on with some copper never sees. Alright, so now over on the bench, we're going to start stripping down our caliper bracket. What I mean by that is there's going to be several things on this that we have to remove so we can fully clean this and then re-lubricate it. Now let's start off with the tins. These are the areas that go in between the bracket and the pads themselves. Let's go ahead and see if I can pull this off of here. If you needed to, you could also try to use a pry bar or screwdriver. Carefully get in between this area and gently pry it off. We'll set those aside. Now the next thing that we're going to do is remove our caliper slider pins. That's these areas right along here. To do this, what I want to do is just carefully grab onto that slider. With my other hand, I'm going to carefully grab onto the boot as well. I'll grab the slider, give it a little twist, and break it free from the boot without ripping the boot in any way. After that, just go ahead and remove that caliper slider. We'll set it down on the corresponding side that we removed it from. Now the next thing that we're going to do is move along to removing the caliper slider boots. To do this, I'm going to carefully grab onto it, and as you can tell, when I squeeze it with my thumb, it starts to separate from the caliper bracket. If yours doesn't try to separate, just carefully use a pick or a small screwdriver and get it in there so you don't rip the boot in any way. Once you have it off of there, just go ahead and give it a little squeeze and a tug and just pretty much roll it around. What we're looking for is to see if it's dry and brittle and it doesn't want to squeeze. This one's nice and soft and pliable. Also, we're looking for any type of dry rot or crack or anything like that might make it so moisture or debris can make its way inside this caliper slider. As you can tell, this one looks fine. That one's fine as well. Now, since we have the caliper slider boot in our hand, we might as well start cleaning these out. To clean them, what we want to do is just get right inside this area with a nice clean rag. It's not a good idea to use any type of parts cleaner on these because it will make it dry and it could potentially damage it overall. I'm pretty much just rolling the rag around the inside of that. Now you just want to thoroughly inspect it, make sure it's free and clear of any debris that might be located inside that boot. This one looks fine. So I'll go ahead and do the same to the other side. Now we're going to move along to cleaning our caliper slider pins. If you were to look at the pair of them, you're going to see that they're two different pins. That's why it was super important to make sure you put them on the corresponding sides. Now this slider pin right here, up where my index finger is, you can tell there's a rubber bushing on this. This is a vibration dampener. You need to make sure you have it on the same exact side that you removed it from. It's super important. To clean these, typically all I do is just take that same rag that I've been using. I'm just going to go ahead and wipe down the entire shaft of this slider pin. And then you also want to pay attention to up where my thumbnail is here. You can't tell because I have my gloves on, but right essentially in this area closest to where this hexagon is, there's actually a little groove here. That's the groove that the boot's going to sit. You need to make sure it's clean and free of any debris inside that area. That's going to help keep moisture out of there. Also inspect the shaft of both of the slider pins and just make sure it doesn't look like it's pitted or anything the like. As you can tell, this one looks like it's in great shape. I can continue on to cleaning up the next one here. Wipe that down. Get all the way up inside that groove, of course. Inspect that caliper slider pin. Now we can set that down. Now the next thing we're going to do is start cleaning up the caliper bracket itself. For this, I'm going to go ahead and grab a nice collection receptacle here so we can recycle the chemical. Now I want to start spraying inside of these ports right here. When I spray in, just keep in mind fluid might try to make its way out, so make sure you're wearing hand and eye protection at all times. Now we'll just use a caliper bore brush here. This bristle brush is essentially just going to go right inside those ports. We're going to move it around while it spins and clean out any debris that's inside this area. Give them a little rinse. Now you want to thoroughly inspect inside each of these holes right here. Once again, we're making sure it's not pitted or covered in any type of debris. Once you're sure that looks good, let's continue on to the four corners where you remove those tins from. In between each of these areas is exactly where those pads are going to sit. If you don't clean up this area, your pads might get stuck in the bracket and you might find that you have a braking issue. For these, I'm just going to go ahead and use the sanding disc and clean it down. You want to be very careful if you're sanding it not to remove very much of this metal right here. We essentially just want to get rid of any of the dirt or debris that might be in this area. As you can tell, I'm using a cloth disc on this because I don't want to remove very much of the material from the bracket, as I mentioned. Now this side right here looks perfect. Let's go ahead and turn that caliper bracket over and do the exact same thing. If you don't have one of those discs, you can also use a wire brush. Now as you can tell, I have all four corners of the caliper bracket nice and clean. There's bare metal there, and that's very important. Now before I can continue on with those four corners, I'm just going to use my wire brush and I'm going to try to get in between the area where that rotor is going to be spinning around. That's essentially in between this groove on both sides. Essentially, we just want to get off any rust or debris that might be in this area so it doesn't fall into the brakes once they're done. Okay, so now at this point we can continue on with some high temperature caliper grease. It's super important to make sure that you use the high temp grease because of course your brakes get very hot. You want something that's not going to break down and liquefy and potentially get on your brakes. Speaking of that, when we do this, we're only going to try to apply a little bit of this grease right here. Essentially this is just for vibration dampening, noise reduction, and of course to keep moisture away from the area that you just finished cleaning up. Okay, so now it's time for our brand new caliper tins here. What you want to do with these is go ahead and line them up with the position that they're supposed to be in. We can feel that this just wants to slide right in. Once you do that, you want to lock it in by pressing in this center aspect here. That's where the locking tabs are. We'll give it a little squeeze and then just give it a little tug to make sure it's completely secure. That feels pretty good. We'll do the same to the other side. Lock it in. Give it a wiggle, make sure nothing falls off. Next, it's going to be time for the caliper slider pins here. For the caliper sliders, we're going to make sure that we coat the entire shaft of the slider pin. Of course, all the way up at the bushing as well. It only makes sense. Now obviously you want to make sure that this is well lubricated, but you don't necessarily need to have a big old pile of grease on there. That's just going to end up blocking things up inside. While I'm coating this, what I want to do is come all the way up to where my fingers are up here, where I'm holding it, and get into that groove that I talked to you about, where that boot's going to sit. That's super important because that's going to help keep the moisture out of there. Now let's take our caliper slider boot, and we're going to take this ridged area here, where you can tell that it has a little cutout, and carefully press it right into the caliper. Now generally for this, I just take a tiny bit of grease and I'm going to come right inside this area. That's going to help make sure that no moisture gets in there and doesn't make it so the boot's going to get stuck in case we go to do the brakes at a later time. Slide it in there, give it a little turn here just to make sure it's completely situated. Now after that, we're going to take our caliper slider pin, we're going to slide it directly inside there. Alright, so once it's pressed in, just go ahead and grab onto it. We're going to give it a little wiggle. Essentially, we just want to make sure the grease is completely worked into this area. After that, continue on doing the exact same thing for the other slider. All the way up into that groove. Take that slider, slide it right into position. Give that boot a little squeeze, work it around, make sure it functions properly. Now at this point, you just want to double check all of your work, make sure everything's secured, and now we can get back over to the vehicle. Alright, so now it's time to go ahead and clean up our brand new rotor. To do this, I'm just going to use some parts cleaner directly on the braking surface. We'll wipe this down. Keep in mind that the rotor does have two braking surfaces. You also have the rear of the rotor to clean down as well. Now we can take that rotor, we're going to go ahead and slide it right onto the mating surface of that hub. After that, I always take one of my lug nuts. I'm going to put on here so it bottoms out against the rotor, holding it in place while we continue. So now that we have the rotor on there, the next thing that I always like to do is just confirm that my caliper pistons are completely pushed into the caliper. These right here are considered the pistons, and around those you have the boots. Now to push these in, typically you're going to want to make sure that you do them at the same exact time. So to use a tool like this, you wouldn't want to just try pushing in one piston because that's going to push out this other piston. And then you went here, it's going to do the opposite. If you have this type of tool, what you would want to do is just take one of your original pads, stick it in here, and then you're just going to carefully grab on like that, and then you're going to press them both in at the same time. Let's make sure this is in as far as it can go. Check this one. Now once you have that done, the next area that you want to pay attention to is those piston boots that I just talked to you about. You want to look at them, see if it looks like they're torn, worn, or damaged in any way. Also, you want to see if you see any fluid coming from around the area where the piston is and the seal. If there is, that means that the seals internally on the caliper are no good and you have to replace the caliper. As you can tell, this one looks amazing, so we can continue. I'll just set this aside and let's grab onto that bracket and start mounting it on. Now that we have the caliper pistons pushed back properly and we inspected the caliper, let's continue on with some more of that high temperature caliper grease. We're just going to go ahead and apply this along each of the caliper pistons, essentially around the metal aspect of these. Now once you have that fully coated, go ahead and make your way over to the other side of the caliper, to these three prongs. We're going to go ahead and put a little coating along these as well. Once again, this grease is to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Set that aside. The next thing you're going to want to do is apply a little bit of red thread locker to each of your mounting bolts. Now we can go ahead and slide our caliper bracket over this. Take our two mounting bolts, we'll start each of these in. After that, we're going to bottom these out, and then we're going to torque each of them to 91 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to install our brake pads. Now looking at the pads, what you're going to notice is on one of the ears of each of them, you're going to have the small wear indicator tab right here, but you're also going to have this spring retainer right there as well. So what you want to do is grab two pads so they look just like this when you go to put them into the vehicle. Each of these tabs needs to be in the face up position. You don't want to install them upside down. Let's start with the outer brake pad. Now with this one right here, we can tell that we have this tab. It's actually going to sit right up along this outer portion of the tin. They actually specifically made it right for that area. Let's go ahead and slide this in. We're going to start with the top area. And we can slide this into the bottom as well. And then we'll just carefully slide it in. After you get it in there, just wiggle it around. You want to make sure that it can move around freely without clacking around like this. This feels perfect. Now if you had to use a hammer to try to drive it in there, typically that means that you didn't clean up the caliper bracket enough. Let's do the same to the inner pad. Okay, for the inner pad, I'm just going to go ahead and take a double check real quick because it's harder to see. You just want to make sure that your tabs are sitting in the proper position. That's perfect. Now we can grab our caliper, we'll slide it into position and grab those 2 caliper mounting bolts. Now we can start in both of those bolts with that thread locker on them. Okay, now we can bottom these out, and when we torque these, it's going to be 34 foot-pounds. Now that we have it on there, let's just double check everything. We know that we torqued everything as we needed, but you also want to pay attention to the flex hose itself. It's common when you remove the caliper and you go to hang it, it might spin a couple times. If that's the case, you might find that this is a little curlicue, and that could restrict brake fluid, so you need to make sure it looks just like this. Okay, we're sure everything looks good. Let's get back out here. We'll go ahead and remove this lug nut from the rotor. Grab the wheel. Let's get it up on here. Now we're going to start on all 5 of our lug nuts. We'll bottom these out in a crisscross manner, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we're going to torque each of these lug nuts to 83 foot-pounds. So at this point, we have the wheel back on the ground. Let's go ahead and torque these to 83 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay, friends, we got one side of the front brakes done. What's left to do now? Now, of course, you're going to want to make sure that you do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, go ahead and hop inside that passenger compartment, pump up the brake till it's nice and firm. After you've done that, make your way underneath the hood. We're going to check that master cylinder. Make sure it's nice and full of .3 brake fluid. If it isn't, carefully open it up, top it off with some .3, close the hood, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.